It's hotter than Hades out here. It is humid like you wouldn't believe, but it's time to brew. Okay, so this is basically the start of every brew session for me. I've been brewing now with just pure distilled water. So in this batch I'm putting in 4 gallons of distilled water, and then I usually adjust my water chemistry from there. I just buy it at the store. It's nothing special. It's Poland Spring distilled water. I think I'll show it to the camera here in a minute. But I like doing this because I'm building my own water chemistry from scratch, and our tap water is pretty high in sodium chloride, so I can kind of dial that in myself. So right here I'm adding the water salts that I need. This recipe was 3 grams of calcium chloride and 2 grams of calcium sulfate. I didn't need much more calcium than that because I was using the acid malt to adjust my pH. So I getting the fire going here before I go mill the grains. So I'm starting my burner and stirred in my salts, and that is pretty much how I get started. Throw my thermometer in, put the lid on, and off we go. Alright, so this view here is I'm just showing you how I put my mash tun together. So I use a big false bottom, fits in my cooler. It's got a little elbow hose barb on it, and I just have a short piece of flexible hose. It's pretty easy to make that connection. So this brew session today, I decided I was just going to use my 10-gallon Igloo beverage cooler, which you can see here, just standard orange cooler, nothing special to it. So I put the false bottom in there, and there it is, attached to a hose barb on the other side of the ball valve. And then here is the crushed grain. I didn't bother to film any footage of me crushing the grain. I think we've all seen that before. So moving on to checking my sparge water, my strike water temperature, just giving it a stir, make sure those salts are dissolved, and checking out whether or not it's at temperature ready to go. Those handles were a little hot, so I had to run inside and get some gloves. A smarter guy would probably have gloves ready to go at the time. So I just tend to manhandle the brew kettle at this point. I do have a pump, which you'll see it a little bit later, that I can use for moving liquids around. But when I'm using this cooler and I'm just trying to get stuff started, get that mash started before I bring out the rest of the equipment, I find it easier just to use this standard 10-gallon pot, heat up my water, dump it into the cooler, and I'm ready to go from there. Okay, so this recipe, which is going to be a wit beer recipe, has got 50% wheat, and it also has some flaked oats in there. So because all of those grains don't have any husk material to help lauter, I decided to use some rice hulls. I don't bother to measure my rice hulls. I just throw them in by hand. I could weigh them out. Maybe it's about half a pound. That bag is like a 1-pound bag of rice hulls. So I just put some in by hand, get them into the mash tun, then I'll stir it up with my spoon just to get them hydrated. Not a big deal. I don't really know why I put my thermometer in there because it gets covered in rice hulls. So I'm sort of just checking the temperature, make sure I'm not losing too much temperature before I get ready to put the grain in. Here are my flaked oats. I'm going to toss those in. Notice I didn't crush those with the rest of the grist just because they're flaked oats. They don't tend to need to get crushed. I have crushed them in the past, and they get a little bit even more mushy than usual, and sometimes that can lead to a stuck sparge. But in this session today, I didn't have any issues with stuck sparge. I think that 2 or 3 big handfuls of rice hulls helped out quite a bit there. So I'm just going to stir this in and get the mash ready to go, check my temperature, and then I'll put the lid on and it should be ready to go. Okay, a quick break from the brew session to talk about the Catalyst from Craft-A-Brew. You can see I've got no beer in here yet, so that's the motivation to brew on one of the hottest days of the year we have so far. So I've already cleaned this once, but I'll turn the camera around and I'll show you a quick cleaning session of cleaning this out again. I'm gonna clean it, I'm gonna get some Sanitize in there and slosh it around a few times and just let it sit while the brew session finishes out there. Currently about 15 minutes into the mash, so that's a good time to come in and get your fermenter ready. And I'll put the parts in, whatever little bit of sanitizer I leave in here, and it should be good to go for the end of the brew session. So stick with me. I hope you enjoy the brew session and watching me sweat it out on this very hot day. So can't wait to check this out. Cheers. All right, I sped this clip up a bit because I don't think we need to spend a lot of time watching me clean out a fermenter, but I'm just going to clean it out with some PBW, hot water. I'm mixing it around with the hose, and I use a paper towel to get it up on the sides and rinse it out really well. I haven't used this fermenter before, so it doesn't need to get super clean. Then after I get a couple good rinses and get all the PBW out of the valve area because it was kind of stuck in there, I'm just going to fill it with some Star San. I'll put the jar back on the bottom and then open the valve just to get the Star San down into the jar. Put the lid on and shake it around a few times, and it'll just sit like that until I'm ready to transfer the wort from the brew kettle at the end of the brew day into the fermenter. All right, so in this clip here, I just want to show you how I've got my pump set up. So it comes out of the brew kettle and it goes through the pump and it's going right into my plate chiller. I use a Chiron plate chiller and it recirculates back into the top of the brew kettle. I put a little bit of warm water into the brew kettle. I've got the fire going and the pump is running, so it's circulating. Then I put a little PBW up there so that I can get a good clean on that plate chiller from the last time I brewed. I just do this to start to get the cleaning process going while I'm waiting for the mash to happen. I've already moved the mash tun up onto the brew stand just to get it out of the way. And right now you can see how I've got that set up. So it comes out of the pump, through the Chiron and back into the top of the brew kettle, and then I think I'll show you at the top. Yep. So then I just have another hose at the top with it recirculating. I used to use this as a mash tun, so I have it just set up there where it's going back in. It's circulating. You can see there's some PBW in there, and that is that. So that'll get my plate chiller cleaned, and then a little bit later on, I actually run Star San through the plate chiller as well as I get closer to the end of the boil. Most of the time in brewing is about cleaning and keeping things sanitary. So I was running that PBW through the kettle and I realized, you know what, I gotta clean that out with my trusty toilet brush. So if you don't have a toilet brush, you should get one. It's a great way to clean out the kettle. So I have taken my pump stand and I've moved it over to the mash tun so I can start to recirculate the mash. You'll see here that I've actually taken the plate chiller out of the loop, so it's just coming out of the mash tun through the pump into that outlet. And so see, that's the loop. I just stuck the hose there so it was out of the way. But now here's the top of the mash. The mash is ready to go. It's been 60 minutes. So now I'm going to draw some of that mash through the pump. I've already flushed water through the lines, so I don't get PBW into the wort, but I'm going to just start to run a little bit of wort through the whole system there to make sure that the pump is still primed, and I've got wort running through all the tubes before I move the tubing over to the brew kettle and start filling my brew kettle. So it just takes a little bit sometimes playing with the pump. The pump is running. I just have a valve to get the flow to go. I think in this clip I forgot to open the valve on the mash tun, so I'm opening the mash tun valve and then slowly opening the valve on the pump. You can see that's the PBW coming out, or the rinse water coming out. And as soon as I get good flow, right about there, I turn that off because I don't want to waste any of that wort, especially the first runnings wort. So I'm just going to put that fitting, that tubing up towards the top so I can gently recirculate the wort through the mash bed, setting the mash bed, and helps clarify the wort. Makes for a clearer wort without too many grain particles in it. Sometimes when I mash in my stainless steel kettle, I actually can get crystal clear wort because I recirculate the whole time. But today, this brew day, I just wanted a quicker brew session, so I'm using the cooler. And you'll see it in the next clip how the wort looks after recirculation. But it's just running through the pump, not too fast, and just coming out the top. I use that clamp to hold the hose up there so it doesn't come out and just run wort all over the patio, because that would be tragic. So here's a good shot of the wort that's post recirculation. So it's pretty clear. There aren't any major grain particles in there. It is still a little bit hazy, but that's okay because that's just sugar and protein and stuff in the beer. But the good news is that there isn't a ton of yeast, sorry, not yeast, but grain particles. So the nice thing about the pump is I'm just going to move that tubing over, the quick release tubing over to the bottom of the brew kettle and use the valve there as the input for the next step. And the next step is simply just opening the pump and starting to drain the mash tun through the pump into the kettle. And I have only recently started doing this sort of underletting from the bottom, but it works pretty good, and it just allows me to not really have to. I used to draw into a bucket and pour the bucket in, but this way I can just use the pump and I'm not busting my back picking up the fermenter or a bucket of wort. Alright, so I've already transferred the first set of runnings over to the kettle, and I'll probably usually start the burner and start getting those up to boiling temperature. Here I am picking up the big thing of sparge water. This is 5 gallons of sparge water. I mashed in with 4 gallons, and now I'm just going to sparge with 5, and I'm going to hope to collect about 7.5 gallons of wort in the end. So I'm going to disconnect the tubing, and I will recirculate after I stir the mash up a little bit. Make sure that I just get good contact with the sparge water and all those grains. It's probably not entirely necessary, especially if I'm going to do a recirc, but old habits are hard to break, and it's easy enough to just stir it up and take a good look at it. So I think I moved the camera here. Sorry for jostling it around, but it's all in the name of getting a good shot so we can see that mash there. So it was pretty loose because it's 5 gallons into the batch and at this point instead of 4, but that's fine. That's just how I usually do it. I don't try to equalize the input and output from the 2 sets of runnings. I've never really found that to be totally useful. So there you go, and then I'll recirculate that for a bit and run that into the kettle too. So, and that's how much wort I have at that moment. So for this clip, I figured I would just give you a different perspective out into my vegetable garden and into the backyard and my neighbor's house. I've got my refractometer. I've combined all the runnings together here, so I'm just trying to get a look at what's the gravity of my batch, and am I on pace with where I thought I would be. I think this batch right here came at about 1034, and I collected just over 7 gallons of wort. So when I boil that down, I'm going to try to boil that down to about 1040, 1042, and that should be a pretty easy drinking wit beer for the summertime. Here's a gratuitous boil shot. I didn't spend a lot of time showing it come up to a boil. I think we've all seen plenty of boil shots. And then in the next clip, here's my first hop addition. It's a little bit of EKG. There was a later hop addition there too, but I didn't show you that. So here's my fermenter with the star sand in it. I'm going to pour that out. I've shaken it around several times during the day just to make sure it's totally sanitized. Put the airlock on there so that stuff doesn't float in from the outside air. Here I'm just using a spray bottle of star sand to clean the tubes, just because that's going to now be sitting in the wort. And I've got the chiller. I've already flushed water through my chiller, sanitized it through my chiller, and sanitized it again. Now I'm hooking up the water lines to the chiller from my garden hose. This is just a double female ended hose section that I made, so I can put my garden hose on there. Then I use a small garden disconnect to a scrap piece of hose just to send the water out into the garden, or I usually collect the hot water in a couple buckets for cleaning. So once that's all set up and ready to go, the pump is running, the pump is primed. I'm just going to run some of the star sand out of the chiller, and once wort's coming out, we're good to go. And I'm going to start filling up the Catalyst fermenter with fresh wort. So here's the end of the filling up close. Look at that cold break coming out of the chiller. It looks great. Super excited about this batch. I love some wheat beer in the summertime, and I'm excited to see how the Catalyst performs as a fermenter.
Okay, there it is. A little over 5 gallons of what's going to be Belgian Wit beer. This is supposed to be my orange wheat recipe, but moving a camera around and trying to do all the shooting, I didn't put the orange peel in at the boil. I usually do that in the boil. So I'm going to put it in, once fermentation gets going, I'll put the orange peel in there and I'll capture some video of that. But right now I've got a little over 5 gallons of wort, and I dropped a sanitized thermometer in there so I could check it. I was able to chill it down to about 78, so still too warm to pitch the yeast. I've got a Y yeast 3944 Belgian Wit right here, which is swollen up nicely. I actually smacked this before I started, so this is ready to go, but it'll last until tomorrow morning. So I'm gonna try to squeeze this guy into one of those beer fridges, get it chilled down overnight, because it is really hot down here. It's still about 75 degrees in the basement. So I want to get this down to under 70, and I'll pitch my yeast and we'll see where we go. So there you have it, a brew session and filling the Catalyst fermenter. So far it's really cool. Like, we can see it. We see some of the cold break in there starting to settle out. I left the jar on the bottom is closed. There's a little bit of sanitizer in there. I'm going to leave that closed until this stuff settles out, and I'll capture some video when I open that valve and try to capture some of the dump that comes from the bottom of the cone before I put the yeast in. So, Mike from brew-juice.com, I hope you enjoyed this video. I've sweated it out there. Stay tuned for more on the Catalyst fermenter. Cheers!